Hi everyone, for those who don't know me, I'm Rob Knight and I'm the CTO of Enterprise Cloud Products at SUSE. I get to spend my time talking with our customers and partners about all things cloud native and how they can embrace technologies like Kubernetes. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today, what your enterprises should be looking for when it comes to Kubernetes management and Kubernetes management platforms, and then talk a bit as well about how we approach that at SUSE and kind of what are some of our open source offerings in that space. So as with the last presenter, I just turn off my camera so you can see the slides in full. And just quickly, for those who haven't come across SUSE, perhaps you read about us in the news. We have been on a great little acquisition spree lately and gone public. But we are a leader in innovative, reliable, and enterprise-grade open source solutions. Many of you who have run traditional Linux workloads, SAP is a great example, probably would have heard of us before. Initially, we launched with our Linux operating system, SLES, but over the years we've evolved into all sorts of different software-defined infrastructure areas, and now as the world is going more and more cloud native, through our relatively recent acquisition of Rancher, we're also a leader in that space as well. And as Ron touched on, right, open source, that is core to everything that we do at SUSE. There is not a product that we have that is not 100% open source. We don't have any kind of complex open-ish licensing models with our technology either. The only thing our customers pay for is a support subscription and on occasion professional consulting services. And I'm mentioning that just because if I do mention some products that we do have, it's worth bearing in mind that there's nothing stopping your teams going and grabbing the files from our repositories today and playing around. You don't need to contact us or pay anything to do that. Only if you need enterprise support, you need to do that. And when you are running these technologies in production, you absolutely do want enterprise support, I can assure you. So in terms of the cloud, right, we've just had a great talk about how AWS can enable modern applications and application modernization. And as time goes on, we're seeing this impact more and more areas within the business as well as the wider economy as a whole. Although there's many different technologies that can enable modern application development and things like microservices, one of the key ways to do that is with containers. Containers is a topic we've heard a lot about over the years. I'm not going to teach people to suck eggs here. Containers are just a great way to package and deploy applications. But containers do come with their own baggage. They need to be managed effectively. You need an effective way to start them, to redeploy them, to upgrade them, a way to integrate them together to actually form a complete workload or application. In a lot of cases, success using containers means we need to be able to scale them up and down as demand changes. We need to be able to rapidly customize them to fit into whatever use case we need them to fit in. And what we found with a lot of our customers is that as their environment grows and as their use of container technology does grow, so do the challenges that come with managing containers. Those kind of complex interworkings of containerized workloads. The trouble kind of grows as you adopt it more and more. And this is where Kubernetes comes in. You know, a phrase I'm sure many of the call have heard many times before. But in essence, those challenges are why Kubernetes was built. Kubernetes is the answer to a lot of those challenges that organizations face as they scale out their use of container. It's definitely one of the best container orchestrators out there, ensuring that the right container is running in the right place with the right number of replicas connected to the right backing or dependent services at the right time. And as time goes on, Kubernetes is managing a lot more than just containerized workloads. Even within SUSE, we've already got offerings that use Kubernetes to manage virtual machines, to manage storage as well. As Kubernetes penetrates deeper into the data center and further out to the edge, that list is just going to keep growing and growing. When we look at why companies, when they come and, when they speak to us, when I'm sat there in the room with the CIO and the CTO, and we're talking about why are they interested in Kubernetes and containers, these are the main things that kind of come out. And also some of the reasons why these people say that Kubernetes is the future for their IT platform, wherever they are running. They need it to enable innovation and enable modernization. We hear a lot about hybrid IT these days, and Kubernetes can act as a great platform for all the hybrid IT workloads that you're looking to run. As we also know, the world is moving more and more to an API-driven approach. I've put an example in there from the finance industry, the shift to open banking, and we're seeing this also happen in other industries as well. Another great reason to consider Kubernetes, because there's a strong chance that your competition is or will be in the future as well. It's definitely one of the #1 things I get told is we're looking into this because they've heard their competitor is doing it and they don't want their competitor to get an extra edge in the game that they don't have. There's also some opportunities for cost reduction as well. If you employ an effective Kubernetes strategy, you can make better use of the resources of clouds that you've got, which can then help balance the additional compliance burden that comes with Kubernetes and containers. Kubernetes itself, I'm not going to go too deep into the architecture, it's just effectively a clustered platform to host containers. There's a control plane, and I'm mentioning it because it's kind of relevant later on when I talk about Rancher, and then there's worker nodes that actually run the workloads. Both the control plane and those worker nodes, they can be run on-premise, they can be run in the cloud, they can also be pushed out to the edge as well to run workloads at the edge. Kubernetes adoption initially happened quite rapidly. And during the early days of Kubernetes adoption, it became quite clear that some higher level requirements emerged, especially when organizations were thinking about how they can make Kubernetes a success. And this is where the need for multi-cluster and multi-cloud management comes into play. And I want to take a quick look at that now. Early adopters of Kubernetes initially began by building their Kubernetes infrastructure in the same way that they had done traditionally for many years, and they ended up building large monolithic clusters. But they quickly realized that when it came to actually adapting those larger clusters to their specific use case or business requirements, it was quite challenging. Different workloads have different needs. A new AI/ML app has completely different requirements to a business process management app, for example. Companies want to take advantage of the cloud and retain the benefits of Kubernetes. And large monoclusters, they just can't adapt fast enough. So when we talk about enterprise-wide adoption of Kubernetes, it can be difficult to handle the overhead and risk that's introduced by not deploying and managing and securing multiple different Kubernetes clusters in the same way. And this is where the concept of Kubernetes management comes in. How do we manage these clusters? We don't want one single huge cluster for all of our IT workloads. We want multiple clusters, each tailored for a specific use case. And we need to be able to manage all of those clusters. We need to be able to manage the lifecycle of the clusters. We need to be able to centralize the security of those clusters and all of those extra benefits that come from Kubernetes management. The reason we talk about this is because over time, when deploying multiple clusters, if not done with a proper management strategy, it can become very chaotic. And as the title of the session is, we're looking to try and contain that chaos with proper Kubernetes management. Now, there's a few different Kubernetes management platforms across the market. And I do think that the need for Kubernetes management applies to pretty much any organization that wants to embrace Kubernetes at scale. The different management solutions all have a slightly different approach. When it comes to what we think about this at SUSE, we believe that in a multi-cluster world, as I just talked about, we need to be able to deploy and manage multiple clusters in different environments on top of different infrastructure and manage them in the same way. We've been dealing with this now at SUSE for more than 4 years. We were one of the first to have an effective multi-cluster Kubernetes management solution, and it's one of the most popular open source Kubernetes management solutions today. It's also fair to say that as we get close to entering 2022, Kubernetes distributions are now commoditized. And what I mean by that is the value that Kubernetes brings isn't in the Kubernetes distribution that you choose. There's so many different Kubernetes distributions tailored ever so slightly for different use cases. including the popular cloud-hosted distributions, that the argument that one vendor's distribution is superior to the others doesn't hold much water anymore. When it comes to a Kubernetes management platform, the value to the business is in how you manage those distributions, regardless of where they're from. You should have a Kubernetes management tool that allows you to interact with any Kubernetes distribution so that you can choose the best distribution for your use case without sacrificing on the benefits given by Kubernetes management. So that's why we say that the value is really in Kubernetes management. And when it comes to what we do with SUSE Rancher, is we unite multiple different Kubernetes distributions under a single centralized pane of glass, a great web UI, command line interface, and an API as well that developers can use. It allows you to manage your on-premise clusters as well as those that are hosted on native cloud services, all from a single point of view. It allows you to centralize security and authentication. You can tie hundreds of downstream clusters together with your Active Directory or Okta for single sign-on in a few clicks. When it comes to open source, as I touched on earlier as well, Kubernetes itself is an awesome open source technology. And when we talk about Kubernetes management and what tool you choose for that, I do feel that you also want a Kubernetes management tool that embraces that open ethos as well. As I briefly mentioned, when it comes to what we do with SUSE Rancher, any CNCF certified Kubernetes distribution can be managed in exactly the same way, wherever that is running, allowing you to choose what vendor specifically meets the use case for the project that you need that Kubernetes cluster for. We also support x86 and ARM architectures. We support Windows for worker nodes, Kubernetes worker nodes, and we've also got System Z Kubernetes workers coming soon as well, allowing you to choose the right technology for whatever app you need to actually deploy. And that's key when it comes to modernizing or transforming your apps. This is just a very brief architecture overview of what something looks like with the SUSE Rancher open source Kubernetes management platform. SUSE Rancher sits on top of your underlying Kubernetes clusters. Of course, we do have a Kubernetes distribution ourselves, RKE. We've also got an edge optimized distribution, K3S, but you could also be integrating Amazon EKS, Azure AKS. You can even be integrating Red Hat OpenShift and gaining all of the benefits of centralized Kubernetes management, regardless of what that downstream cluster is. So these are things like centralized logging, centralized audit. If you need to be able to deploy a service mesh across all of your downstream clusters, you can do that with a couple of clicks. Centralized monitoring is all kind of part of the deal, as well as a centralized catalog for apps. Our customers really kind of feel the benefit of this because it doesn't matter what distribution they actually use underneath, they can manage it all in exactly the same way. It also means that when it comes to the public clouds, if you are embracing a multi or hybrid cloud strategy, your teams don't need to learn all of the APIs from all of the major cloud vendors because we abstract those underlying APIs, as any good Kubernetes management solution would do. Then your teams just need to learn how to use the Kubernetes management tool to build, manage the lifecycle of clusters, grow them, shrink them, etc. When it comes to how this kind of looks, kind of as a whiteboard architecture, I'm going to take a quick look at that now. As I mentioned, we have this management server, and in our case, that's SUSE Rancher, and that can be deployed on any Kubernetes cluster of your choosing. Once we have deployed our management infrastructure, we then add downstream clusters for it to manage. Now, our management platform, SUSE Rancher, can go out and deploy clusters itself on-prem or in the cloud, or it can use vSphere if you've got a VMware infrastructure, for example. But we can also import clusters that you've already deployed. Perhaps they've been up and running a couple of years. It takes a couple of commands to import those clusters into the management platform and then bring all of those benefits I just talked about to your existing clusters. For each individual cluster, we can then centrally manage them, bring centralized authentication, centralized policy. We can manage app deployments, manage the app lifecycle a lot easier as well. Developers don't have to learn as much about Kubernetes to be able to deploy apps on top of Kubernetes. The operations team is also a lot happier as well because they've got centralized monitoring, logging, centralized security. They've got integrated storage and workload management as well. When you have effective Kubernetes management, it also makes it easier to integrate with your existing systems. You don't have to migrate your identity provider just because the Kubernetes distribution you've chosen doesn't support it out of the box. We can take care of all of that for you. You can also integrate very well with any existing CI or CD system that you've got in place. When we take a look at what this actually looks like, from an operations and management perspective, we provide a clean and consistent UI to provision and manage the lifecycle of any Kubernetes distribution on any infrastructure provider. Rancher becomes the single point of provisioning and lifecycle management in that sense. We also have first-class support for cloud-hosted Kubernetes distributions for AWS, Azure, and Google. So you never actually need to talk to Azure, Google, or AWS to build a Kubernetes cluster. You give Rancher your API credentials, it will go off, build it, manage the lifecycle of it, and then when you're ready to remove it, you can take care of that as well. I touched on earlier centralized authentication. Now, as someone that's worked with Kubernetes for many years, I know if I've got 10, 20, 100 downstream clusters, configuring centralized SSO on all of those is a headache because all of those clusters are slightly different. They all have slightly different setup requirements. So having something like Rancher or an effective Kubernetes management platform sit above all of those clusters and manage the authentication for you makes life a lot easier for your operations team. It also keeps your security team happy as well because you've got that centralized security all in one place. As we found out recently from some of our customers, SUSE, we've recently acquired NuVector, the cloud-native container security experts. Within a few hours, all of our customers were able to inspect all of their containers on any Kubernetes distribution, wherever that was running, to see were they susceptible for the recent Log4j security issue. And that's really powerful when you start centralizing these kind of management technologies as well. I mentioned earlier as well, workload management as well. Having a great UI to manage workloads on top of Kubernetes is really quite important. Developers shouldn't be spending their time figuring out how Kubernetes works. It should be a few clicks to be able to package up an application and get it deployed on top of Kubernetes. That's really an area that SUSE Rancher excels. I'm going to go through a couple of case studies now because I can talk about the underlying technology all day, but our customer success stories speak for themselves. First one is the Cardano Group. They're a privately owned, purpose-built risk and investment specialist based out of the UK. They recently acquired a large pension company, so they went from being a kind of a select portfolio of corporate clients to being the third largest retail pension provider in the UK, suddenly serving millions of customers overnight. Initially, they had some homegrown .NET and MS SQL-based infrastructure that was built by the financial analysts to fit their needs. And while those tools suited the group prior to the acquisition, the architecture just couldn't scale with Cardano's growth. The team needed to migrate to a modern, web-based, API-driven, microservice-centric architecture. Now, there's lots of challenges that the team had to deal with this, including the building of new data warehouses, new web platforms as well. But the team wanted an easy way to onboard and manage Kubernetes. Because they had limited resources, initially they embraced the open source Rancher Kubernetes management platform. They were getting this literally for free. They didn't have support initially. And that allowed them to build clusters quickly, to manage the lifecycle of those clusters quickly. They're able to use any downstream cluster that they wanted. So they were able to experiment with different types of Kubernetes distributions and then choose the right ones for their specific workloads. The distribution that they use for their data warehouse is very different from the one that they use for their web platform. So for them, the value was having one management platform to take care of it all. Talking on to a second case study, we're going to talk about Apsa. This is a success story that we're really quite proud of at SUSE, especially because we are starting to replicate it both elsewhere in the region and globally as well. Apsa is a bank in South Africa, an investment company as well, and they've always been trying to push the digital boundaries when it comes to banking. They wanted to innovate to bring new banking experiences to their customers. The technology team at Apsa had long been aware of the value and the benefits of Kubernetes. They had been using it since 2016. Back at that time, the Rancher platform was still evolving, and Apsa actually adopted OpenShift from Red Hat, and they were soon the third largest OpenShift user in the world. But when it came to their renewal in late 2018, they started to review their options. Because their organization had had rapid growth, while OpenShift had served the business well, as I talked about earlier with these larger monolithic clusters, it had certain limitations. They had issues with managing their clusters, and the costs had started to climb. So they began looking for an alternative, and that's then when they initially had a proof of concept with the open source Rancher platform. We were then able to work with them to build a solution that much suited their needs, and they've since been able to migrate over 3,500 different workloads that were running on their legacy OpenShift infrastructure on top of Kubernetes clusters that are managed centrally by Rancher. There's some huge cost savings that they've achieved by doing this because they're now able to centrally provision everything and centrally manage everything. They don't need to send qualified engineers out to individual branches anymore because they can configure it centrally. They just, in effect, send a delivery driver and someone to plug everything in. They turn it on and everything now self-provisions. As of last count, they're managing over 180 different Kubernetes clusters. They're managing those through 12 different Rancher servers, and the number is still increasing daily. Just before I wrap up as well, I think it's important to talk about some of the other things that we're doing in the open source space as well. One of the ones I think most relevant, especially for developer teams, is Rancher Desktop. Now, anyone who's developed with containers may have used Docker Desktop initially to get started. But Docker recently announced a licensing change, which meant larger customers above a certain number of users now had to pay for Docker Desktop. And Rancher Desktop is SUSE's answer to that problem. It's a desktop version of Kubernetes. It's a desktop version of Rancher, and it's a drop-in replacement for Docker Desktop, allowing developers to build and deploy containers on their local machines and then eventually push them to Kubernetes in production as well. And unlike Docker Desktop, it's 100% free and open source software as well. So we are physically not able to make that same kind of decision with regards to licensing. I mentioned at the start as well that Kubernetes is starting to push into additional areas within the infrastructure, and Harvester is a great example of that. Harvester is SUSE's answer to hyperconverged infrastructure. It's a 100% free and open source software platform that uses Kubernetes underneath, but is designed to manage containers and storage, VMs and storage, sorry. It's designed to one day be a drop-in replacement for VMware to be able to manage virtual machines. And then we will eventually get to the point where you're managing your containers, your virtualized infrastructure, and your storage on the same platform. If people are used to a platform as a service style of development, I recommend people check out Opinio as well. Back in the day, Cloud Foundry was very successful because it gave an excellent developer experience in terms of how developers could just push applications straight to production. And effectively, Opinio is designed to replicate that experience, but in a Kubernetes native way, in a lightweight Kubernetes native way. These are just some of the projects that we're working on at SUSE that are related to the kind of Kubernetes and cloud native ecosystem. There's lots more in the pipe, so always kind of keep an eye on that page because there's so much more coming down this area. Just before I hand over to the next speaker slot, a lot of the technologies that both myself and the other people talk about today have a huge skills gap. These are new technologies to a lot of organizations. So that's why we, and as many of the other vendors on this webinar do as well, put a lot of effort into making free training resources available for companies. So we recommend people head to rancher.com/training because there's countless hours of free training available to get your engineers up to speed with this new way of doing things so that you can just be more successful overall as an organization.